Aurora Brown and intersectional psychology acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of country throughout South Africa and their connections to land, water, and community. We pay our respects to their elders past and present, and extend that respect to all Indigenous people listening today. God told me to colonize you. The U.S. Christian Right's new war on Africa. Hello and welcome back to Intersectional Psychology, the podcast that explores psychology's role in promoting social justice. I'm your host, Aurora Brown. I'm a registered counsellor in Cape Town, South Africa. Thank you for being here. Today we are discussing how the US Christian right is colonizing Africa right now. Specifically, how they are working against the rights of LGBTQIA+ people in Africa, as well as sexual and reproductive health and rights in the region. I am honored to have as my guest today an expert on the topic, Dr. Haley McEwen. Haley is a postdoctoral researcher in the Department of Political Science at the University of Gothenburg and a research associate of the Wit Center for Diversity Studies at the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg. Haley's research has been published widely in both academic journals and in popular media outlets. She is also the author of a book titled The U.S. Christian Right and Pro-Family Politics in 21st Century Africa, which was published by Palgrave Macmillan in 2023. So Haley, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Aurora. Great to be here, and hi to all of the listeners today.
About the work of Dr. Haley McEwen. What else can we know about you and your work?
Well, I think you've pretty much captured it all in your introduction. Thank you so much for the warm welcome. I think the only other thing I would like to say is that, in addition to doing academic research, looking at the U.S. Christian right efforts to influence politics of gender and sexuality in African context, is that, I regularly engage with civil society organizations, international NGOs, even government departments in South Africa and elsewhere, where they are really trying to counter anti-rights and anti-gender mobilizations and continue to promote LGBTIQ+ human rights, as well as sexual and reproductive health and rights and sexuality education. So I really, as a decolonial scholar as well, I find it really important, and I prioritize getting my work beyond the academic paywalls. So that's another reason I'm really happy to be with you today, to reach people and bring this kind of information to people who aren't necessarily reading academic journals, which of course is the majority of the population.
Exporting Eden, God, Guns and Glossy Pamphlets in Africa. Now, when we use the term US Christian right groups, which organizations are we referring to?
So this term US Christian right, of course, is an American category used to describe the mostly evangelical branch of conservative politics, the Republican Party in the United States. And I think it's important to mention that up until the early or mid 1990s, the U.S. Christian right, unsurprisingly, they were prioritizing domestic U.S. issues. The, pro-life movement against access to abortion, the anti-gay movement, and things of that nature, campaigns that people in the United States have been familiar with for a very long time. But then it was from the 1990s that they started to realize that they were losing ground at the United Nations and in many countries, particularly those in the global South. So it was around that time that we started to see the founding and establishment of U.S. Christian right groups that were explicitly dedicated to international advocacy. So organizations like the Center for Family and Human Rights, that's CFAM, they were established with the specific purpose of coordinating anti-gay, anti-abortion, etc. actors at the United Nations. And of course, at the United Nations, you have the member states, but then you also have several civil society organizations. And this has been a big place where queer and feminist advocacy groups have been working to advance rights, of course. So it was really, at that time, mid-90s, early 2000s, we started to see the growth of these internationalized U.S. Christian right groups. So in addition to CFAM, there's organizations like Family Watch International that has been very visible in campaigning against comprehensive sexuality education in several African countries. And within those campaigns, there are very strong anti-LGBTIQ narratives and agendas. And then there's other groups like Alliance Defending Freedom, which is a conservative strategic litigation organization. They're operating all over the world. They do campaigns that many people will be familiar with, from the United States, for example, like backing the baker who doesn't want to bake the wedding cake for the same-sex couple, right? And it's a strategic kind of litigation where then they're able to say private businesses don't have to provide services to people that they have conscientious objections to, quote unquote. And there's also groups like World Congress of Families and the International Organization for the Family, which convene international conferences where they gather several different kinds of far-right interest groups to meet, network, strategize, and they have extremely large convenings with thousands of people. So there are many different kinds of U.S. Christian right groups doing this kind of work, all working in their separate spheres, whether it's strategic litigation or having these convenings or mobilizing campaigns or operating at the level of the United Nations. But they all very much have a shared agenda, which is to take their ideology, their political and policy agendas to the world.
Before we delve further into how these groups are promulgating pro-family politics in 21st century Africa, can you give us a better understanding of the relevant historical, socio-cultural, and geopolitical conditions in Africa before these groups began their work?
Sure. Well, I mean, of course, that's a really big question, and we can't cover all of that in this podcast. But I think one really good example is Uganda. So Uganda, during the AIDS pandemic, they had a high prevalence of HIV and AIDS transmission, but at the same time, they also came up with what has become recognized as one of the most effective campaigns for raising awareness about transmission. So they had, I've heard stories from people who worked in these campaigns where they talked about, there were big billboards about condomizing. There was a big public campaign around safe sex. And that was not framed in what has now become an abstinence-only approach. And Uganda had a lot of success with this campaign. But also, as research shows, my research and research conducted by people like Kapia Kauma, who is a Zambian researcher and theologian who's currently based in the United States, and that journalist Jeff Charlotte, who wrote The Family, which was turned into a Netflix series. They've really done some excellent work showing how U.S. Christian right groups, and particularly one group called, Jeff Charlotte writes about it, a group called The Family. It's the Fellowship Foundation. They're the people who put on the National Prayer Breakfast in the United States every year, which is a huge political event. They became very involved in Uganda and really saw Uganda as a strategic foothold in the region. Also, there were other far-right groups that Kapia Kauma writes about who started to, host conferences there saying and telling people that Western countries were trying to promote LGBTIQ plus rights in Uganda, and that this was a kind of nefarious agenda by Western progressives, and that they needed to, defend themselves and defend their cultures from these kinds of influences. And that narrative, of course, has only gained steam over time. But we can see a really dramatic shift in Uganda around how HIV and AIDS prevention and education and awareness was conducted from, before this heavy U.S. Christian right influence to after, which has really shifted to abstinence-based and, criminalization, laws that criminalize people, in this really horrific anti-homosexuality bill. So shifting to also a punitive approach, but yeah, and I think, like in many parts of the world, not only in African countries, but I've also read, in Southeast Asia, for example, or in the United States, in North America, or different parts of Europe, where prior to U.S. Christian right coordinated efforts to create moral panic about LGBTIQ plus rights and sexuality education and reproductive health and rights, you see a big spectrum of opinions. Of course, prejudice exists. Of course, discrimination has been there, but it hasn't had the intensity and shared discourses and rhetoric that we see now, right? And prior to U.S. Christian right influence, initiatives like sensitization workshops or community dialogues, would be effective in just raising awareness and busting stigma, busting prejudice, showing people that reproductive rights is nothing to be afraid of, or queer communities are nothing to be afraid of. But of course, the U.S. Christian right influence has really worked to incite a lot of fear and they weaponize children, for example, saying that queer people and LGBTI rights will endanger children. And that, of course, has a completely different impact on people's perceptions. Also, this idea that LGBTIQ rights are going to imperil the country's national sovereignty and that it's a geopolitical threat elevates the kind of sense of threat, right, that wasn't previously there.
You know, one of the arguments that makes my blood boil the most is this co-opting of decolonial language to position LGBTQIA plus rights as a neo-imperialist imposition that threatens the sovereignty of global South nations, which you mentioned. I can't take the irony of a movement like this US Christian right movement that is literally driven by conservative global North actors claiming to be anti-colonial. I mean, their pro-family agenda is the epitome of colonialism.
It flames on the side of my face.
Not your mama's family values. The dark politics behind the pro-family agenda. Now, these ultra-conservative US Christian right groups use the term pro-family to describe the ideology they campaign for. This label, pro-family, sounds quite innocuous. I mean, who would call themselves anti-family, right? It's something we can all get on board with, whether we're talking about biological family or chosen family. But what exactly does pro-family mean to these US Christian right groups?
Great. Thanks for that question. You know, when they are talking about pro-family, of course, we know that they're really only talking about one kind of family, which is the heterosexual nuclear family involving one cis man, one cis woman who are married and have biological children within a bounded household unit. And of course, we know, and this has been shown in the United States, or, you know, you have African feminists who write about how this form of family has never been practiced as a norm in Africa. And American feminists also saying this is also not a norm in the United States. You have multi-generational families, you have single parent households, you have same-sex parent households, you have many different kinds of family formations. And of course, adopted children. I mean, there are just so many variations on family, and not to mention what you have also raised, which is the issue of chosen family. So they're really talking about one kind of family, and this tactic is something that they, if you dig deep into some of their discussions, you can find U.S. Christian right actors saying things like, "We want to talk about what we are for, not what we are against." Because in talking about what they are against, that's when they get accused of being hate groups. Because we've had people like Scott Lively in Uganda who have said really horrific things about LGBTIQ people, and supporting and encouraging legislation that includes the death penalty for cases of so-called aggravated homosexuality. And that kind of thing brought them a lot of bad press. So the use of this frame, pro-family, allows them to position themselves and appear like they're well-meaning, common sense. As you say, who's going to say they're anti-family? But they say anyone who is advocating for LGBTIQ plus rights or SRHR or CSE, we're all anti-family according to the U.S. Christian right.
Thank you for that. And that last acronym that you used, CSE, I think that's Comprehensive Sexuality Education.
Correct. Apologies. Yeah.
No, all good. So what I'm hearing from you is that these groups aren't simply spreading conservative information. They are politicizing this idea of the family in order to create a sense of families, culture, and tradition being under attack. What can you tell us about the geopoliticization of family?
I think if I could say one more thing about this, it would be the fact that U.S. Christian right groups, and now they're global allies, right? Because there's allies and new far-right organizations in Europe and in several African countries, that they're connecting LGBTIQ plus rights and sexual and reproductive health rights and sexuality education to this idea of sovereignty, that countries in the global south are being infringed upon, they're being subject to cultural imperialism by Western progressives. And when we look at that connection that they are making, and then we also see the kinds of work they're doing at the United Nations to eliminate language around SOGI-SC or CSE or SRHR, like we saw now at the Commission for the Status of Women as the most recent example of this, we can see that they're not only concerned with promoting repressive laws at the national level. We can see that they are challenging the entire liberal international order. And we can see that most clearly in their attacks on the multilateral human rights system, which they target, but they are also co-opting. So we see them co-opting the language of human rights by, for example, saying that the unborn, this idea of fetal personhood, that an unborn child has human rights that are equal to that of the parent who's carrying them. So, of course, that enables them to say that abortion should not be allowed, and it should be criminalized. It shouldn't be allowed. So we can really see they're challenging the infrastructure and the liberal international order. And I don't stand here waving the flag for liberalism, saying it is the best system. It has many problems. And many of its problems are what have got us here in the first place, to this kind of situation. But, I think we also need to think, what kind of future do we want to have? Do we want to have a future where we at least aspire to a world where equality is valued, where it is it's a value that we have, where we aspire for all human rights to be respected? Or do we aspire to a world where it's inequality is the norm, where inequality is something that is seen as good and necessary for societies, like gender inequality and inequality between heterosexuals and queer communities. And finally, you know, the kinds of alignments we can see that are emerging between who is voting against inclusive language around SOGI-SC, for example, at the United Nations. We see several conservative governments voting together against that kind of inclusive language. And those alignments also really challenge the historical alignments we've had for the past 50 years between countries that want to have human rights and that have said that they value and they want to uphold human rights.
Thank you, Haley. That was such an inspiring answer or speech. The Gospel According to Gaslight. How the Christian Right Twists Decolonial Rhetoric. As you've mentioned, US Christian right groups were instrumental in African legislation, like Uganda's 2009 anti-homosexuality bill, which became widely known as the Kill the Gays bill due to the extreme penalties it put forward, including life imprisonment and even the death penalty. However, these Western groups try to hide their involvement and culpability for anti-LGBTQIA+ actions in Africa because, as you said, it gives them a bad name. So how do they try to mask their agendas?
It's a really good question how this is working, because if you look, for instance, on the Family Watch International website, you will see that they have a page now dedicated to their work in Uganda to try and clarify that they had no involvement in the anti-homosexuality legislation. But what is very interesting about those statements of clarification are that they admit that they say we weren't in Uganda helping to create this anti-homosexuality legislation. We were there telling people about the dangers of comprehensive sexuality education. And within these narratives against comprehensive sexuality education, which for your listeners who may not be familiar with it, it's really a rights-based approach to sexuality education that includes topics like safe sex, that includes topics like gender and sexuality diversity and family diversity and consent and bodily autonomy and things of that nature. It's the opposite of the kind of sexuality education that the Christian right organizations want, which is what they call abstinence-only, which is teaching young people that they just should not have sex until they're married. And if they do that, they don't have to worry about, things like getting STIs or unplanned pregnancies. But however, as we know, this is not a reality, for young people in many parts of the world, that they can just abstain. And there's high rates of sexual violence. Of course, there's so many reasons why young people should have access to scientifically accurate sexuality education. Okay, so now that we've got that established, if you look at the kinds of narratives that organizations like Family Watch International and their local African partners like Family Policy Institute have mobilized against CSE, it's really a vehicle for anti-LGBTIQ agendas. So we can see they're saying things like, there are only two genders, right? And no other genders. There's only male and female. It's biologically assigned at birth. It's a biological essentialist reality they're trying to construct. That, this is, of course, erasing and delegitimizing trans communities. Also, their narratives against, saying that teaching young people about gender and sexuality diversity will, quote unquote, homosexualize young people, like encourage them to become queer. So these are the kinds of narratives that they're using to create moral panic about comprehensive sexuality education. So that way, and also, of course, because CSE is school-based, it's something that is for young people, then they're able to mobilize all of this within a package of child protectionism, saying that they are trying to protect children and children are vulnerable, and that UN agencies and Western progressives are trying to sexualize, African youth. But what we hear from young people in many African countries is they want access to better sexuality education and support and services. So this child protectionist weaponizing of children also sidelines the voices of actual children whose lives are impacted, and very much does this thing of speaking for them and trying to catalyze parent community groups, teacher communities, policymakers to turn against to completely change their opinions and they don't want to support comprehensive sexuality education and things like that. But of course, what that also does is it, like the example of the baker, I'm glad we started with that, the cake baker. I mean, once they get that precedent that LGBTIQ awareness of gender and sexuality diversity is dangerous for children, they can snowball that into it's dangerous for society, it's dangerous for economies, it's dangerous for the nation. It's dangerous for civilization is something we will frequently hear them say. So that's really one of the key ways in which they've repackaged and tried to, make their agendas appear as though they are not hate-driven, hate-motivated, religiously motivated agendas that are just about discriminating. That they're trying to present it as though it's about protecting children, nations, economies, and so forth, so on and so forth.
It's me, Aurora. Please excuse me interrupting my own podcast. I'm just here to say that I will never include third-party ads on intersectional psychology, which is great because it means that you can be sure all the mental health information and content shared here is free from corporate influence and bias. However, it also means that this podcast will only be made possible by support from you, the listener. So if you enjoy this podcast or find value in it, please consider joining my Patreon, or Matreon rather, for as little as $3 per month. Your contributions will be used to improve this podcast, to cover the production costs to research, write, record, and edit each episode, and to host our guests. In return, you'll get exclusive Matreon benefits like bonus episodes, additional guided mindfulness recordings, early access to new episodes, extended episodes and outtakes, group discussions, and more. So just go to patreon.com and search for Intersectional Psychology. Thanks, and back to Intersectional Psychology. Haley, you mentioned how these groups basically intimidate potential allies for the queer community into voting against the implementation of comprehensive sexuality education. So, considering their power and influence, I'd imagine researching these groups must have been quite intimidating for you as well. How did you go about that?
My approach to this research has always been about trying to understand the discourses, the rhetoric, the narrative that they are putting out into the public domain. So everything I'm saying in this podcast, everything I've ever written about is all based on publicly available information. I don't find it, it's a whole nother agenda to try and find out information that is not publicly available. But I think to start, we need to just understand what is in the public domain, what is being put out there to try and politicize and radicalize communities against queer and trans communities, against reproductive rights, against sexuality education. So that's really my approach to doing this kind of work. But for my PhD, I did attend one of these gatherings hosted by the World Congress of Families. And for that, I registered as a regular participant. It was open to the public. I registered as myself. I attended, I participated, and it was quite a learning experience, and it was very difficult. It was about, I can't remember if it was 4 or 5 days, but by the last day I was giving myself pep talks, just to get up and go, because it's it's difficult, to be a person who is queer, from a queer family, part of advocacy for human rights, all of these things, and being a feminist and, a decolonial scholar makes it very difficult to sit in the space. But I think it's so important for those advocating for LGBTIQ plus rights and SRHR, etc., to encounter these arguments and understand the community, or try to understand the communities where they're coming from. What are the tactics being used? What are the strategies? Because I think it's very easy to be triggered, of course, by what we hear. And I think that has the effect of shutting us down, and we want to distance ourselves from it. We don't want to engage with it. But I've kind of taken the opposite approach, where I just want to run into the, run to that which is my other, and which others me, to try to understand it better. And I think that's one of the biggest things we can do to try and continue the work of advancing social justice and human rights.
The argument that simply learning about the existence of queer and trans people is going to make children queer or make them decide to transition is just ridiculous. I mean, I grew up in an extremely heteronormative, cisgenderist society. In primary school, they made us line up girls in one line, boys in another, and I was always in the wrong line. That didn't magically make me straight or cisgender, so how could simply hearing about the existence of queer trans people change someone's sexuality or gender identity? It's just absurd. Absolutely.
And if I can just make another point on that, I think that they They know this. I mean, this is what they try and convince people is going to happen. But those who are generating these narratives and circulating them have strategic interests at heart. You know, they're trying to expand this stuff globally. They're trying to gain political allies all over the world. And part of what this is about, you know, is, like I previously mentioned, it's normalizing the idea of inequality. It's also trying to tell us that there is no alternative to heterosexuality and cisgender realities, right? To cisgenderism. This is what they want to say is it. There is no alternative. And also that there's only one life course that a person must take, which is, you know, go to school, you abstain, you get married, then you have sex, then you have kids, then you socialize your kids into these same systems of belief and these power structures, right? So there's a big element of this, you know, when they're saying teaching people about gender and sexuality diversity, it's going to homosexualize them, or it's going to make them question their gender identities, you know, or it's going to tell them they should transition, like it's a recruitment campaign or something. But it's really about, and this is what we can see from a decolonial perspective, is the epistemicide element, this attempt to erase these alternative possibilities to the point where they're not even thinkable. They don't want us thinking about possibilities, let alone pursuing them. Because if we cannot think of them, we cannot do them. So if they can erase a queer and trans existence in textbooks and in policy, then they believe that they can entrench and just normalize the gender binary and the gender hierarchy as the only option. And I think it's another podcast to talk about the other forms of power like capitalism that the gender binary hierarchy and nuclear family model serve, right? But we'll park that for now.
From what you're saying, it doesn't sound like they really believe that they can literally eliminate all queer and trans people. They just don't want us to be acknowledged or to have a voice. So is it just about power then?
Yes. I think the simple answer is yes. And there is a lot of really wonderful decolonial queer and feminist literature that unpacks the ways in which heteronormativity, cisgender normativity, and capitalism are mutually reinforcing. They are co-constructing. It's like a system of intersecting power relations. And also part of that, not to neglect, ableism, it's also a part of this, right? So it's all of these power structures work in the interests of white European men. So at the same time that in Europe that they're, the Victorian time when they're oppressing and instituting these forms of power that excluded European women from political participation and equal economic participation, and were burning women, accusing them of being witches, right? It was the same time when they were using this logic of the gender binary and hierarchy and this nuclear family norm to dismember indigenous societies and indigenous knowledge systems and practices around kinship and community in many parts of the world, right? So yes, it is very much about power, and it's about holding together this power structure. There's a feminist, I don't know if you want to include this, it might be too much, but I'll have to look up the name of the scholar, but she's a feminist theologian, and she used this term kyriarchy. It's KYARIARCHY, to talk about these intersecting forms of dominance. Often, and you say the title of your podcast is Intersectional Psychology, right? We think about intersectionality on the margins often, in terms of how we're trained. If we study social sciences, what we learn about intersectionality is often talking about intersections of oppression. So race, class, gender, that's like the typical one. But also we have to remember there's intersections happening at the centers of power, right? So that's where we can start to see what this is all about. And just going back to the example of the geopolitical dynamics, it shows us it's not just about creating laws at the national level. It's about a global imaginary and an international system that they would like to retain, but also more deeply entrench.
You mentioned how ableism is also part of this power structure. In our first episode of this series, I spoke to a medical doctor, Dr. Anastasia Thompson, who is a trans woman herself. And she explained the curb cut effect as an illustration of how catering to the needs of marginalized people, like disabled folks, actually ends up benefiting society as a whole.
Absolutely. What a lovely connection to make. Yeah.
Power, protest, and possibility. Resisting the Christian right's global agenda. Haley, in conducting this research, what have you learned about global systems of power and oppression? From everything you've said, I can imagine that is a huge question with a huge answer. So maybe we can focus in on how these US Christian right groups have gained such global influence.
Yeah, it's a big question, and there's so many different ways of answering the question. But I think, when it comes to thinking about what is going on, it's really, really important to recognize that these groups are not just trying to the 1950s or 1960s, or in South Africa, like the 1980s. They're not just trying to take us back to old gender norms and gender roles and the denial of children's rights and the entrenchment of inequality between genders and races and all of these things, these dimensions of difference, right? They are really, and people often, and I understand why, we talk about this like it's backlash or it's rollback, or policy erosion. We use this kind of language. But what we're missing when we use this kind of language is a recognition they're not just trying to roll us back. Yes, they are trying to reactivate and reanimate, bring to life the old gender norms, compulsory heterosexuality, compulsory cisgenderism. They're trying to roll us forward. They're trying to take us into a future where, as I've mentioned, inequality is the norm, right? Where this inequality is something that we should accept as natural, as biologically inherited. And now we can also see, and maybe this is another podcast again, is the joining together of, big tech with anti-gender agendas, for example, like gender detection softwares and things that can be used actually to further entrench the gender binary, further entrench the gender hierarchy, and make it appear as though it is completely natural or apolitical because it's using technology. So they're really trying to take us into where nobody is questioning power, where they've taken away our comprehensive sexuality education. They've taken away critical race theory. They've removed diversity, equity, and inclusion from schools and universities and corporations and the public sector, where we don't have the critical capacities to identify, name, and challenge power relations. And thereby, they can be enabled to impose and maintain and reinforce these rigid hierarchies that civil rights movements and human rights movements all over the world have been fighting against and trying to dismantle for decades, and have made incredible progress in doing that. Of course, we know there is so much work to be done. We're really now seeing what power does. Power will never concede power without a struggle, in the words of Frederick Douglass, right? And I think, we need to look back at history. We need to learn from people who have been in the struggle for justice for a long time, and realize that it is an ongoing struggle. And I think at the same time, being kind to ourselves and still and being the change we want to see, in the world around us, as difficult, as hostile as it is, the kinds of political conditions that we are seeing. It's really important to try and live out the values that we would like to see in the world. I spent many years living in South Africa and learning about apartheid. And I mean, the architects of apartheid had to learn that these kinds of systems of rigid power and hierarchy and control are not sustainable, because they are built upon a mythology of racial difference, of gender difference, that you can just categorize people very neatly into different categories, and then you can rank them and assign them social status accordingly. Of course, there's perhaps no better example of sustainable these kinds of systems are. And the tighter they try and turn the screws, the weaker the system becomes. And that, I think, is some hope that I hold out on of how we are challenging, and how the kinds of ideologies and systems that these far-right, ethno-nationalist, Christian right groups they're trying to entrench, that they just simply on their own cannot be sustained.
How can we counter these conservative movements to improve LGBTQIA+ and sexual and reproductive health and rights in Africa?
Yeah, so I think I mentioned previously, educating ourselves about them. And sometimes, if it's too triggering, to do that at a distance, like listening to the podcasts or reading the work of people who have done the research and can kind of present it in a way where it's, you can learn from it without being brought back into a space of trauma yourself. And I think trying to educate ourselves as much as we can is really important. Also, is a maybe it seems like an easy assignment, but maybe it's a increasingly challenging in the world, remaining joyful and not allowing these kinds of actors and these narratives to steal our joy, because, they fear our anger, but they fear our joy even more. And it's something they will never have. I've been at their conferences. They don't know what joy is. They think it's standing on a stage and singing a song or something like that, but they have no clue of what they're missing out on and what it is they're trying to shut down. And it's the joy that keeps us going and keeps us alive, and the joy of being together in communities and meeting each other and connecting, that I think is our biggest hope. And as much as they try and censor or criminalize queer communities and gender diverse trans communities, will always be there. And that is the reality. So I think we need to always be reminding ourselves of this, and doing self-care in community to remind ourselves that, of our collective power and our collective capacities. It's just incredible what we are capable of achieving. So we have to remember that.
Is there anything you came to say that you didn't get to say?
I actually think, you're a really brilliant podcast host. I think we've really covered a lot of ground, and I'm really happy that I was able to join you and that, I got to meet you. And I think, I honestly, I can't think of anything that I didn't get to say. I think I managed to include it all, but your expansive question and well-informed questioning really enabled me to do that. So thank you. I think I'll just say thank you for the opportunity.
And Haley, where can listeners go to find out more about you and your work?
They could check out my book, which came out in 2024, last year, The U.S. Christian Right and Pro-Family Politics in 21st Century Africa. You got it. Next time I see you, I'll sign it for you if we meet in person sometime. And I have a few popular articles online. I also have a short video I did a few years ago on YouTube. It's really looks at the campaign against comprehensive sexuality education that listeners could check out if they want. It's just called the Anti-Gender Movement, and it came out in 2020. It's on YouTube. But otherwise, I keep a low profile, got to keep the air of mystery. So, but I'm also on LinkedIn, not so mysterious on LinkedIn. So any of those places, listeners could connect with me, and I would be happy to meet anyone who would like to chat more.
Thank you so much, Haley, for giving us your time and energy, and for all the work that you do to fight for our joy. And thank you, listener, for being here and for engaging in this topic. I'll speak to you again next week for the next episode in our series on the health of trans and gender diverse people. Look after yourself. Thank you for listening to Intersectional Psychology. Please follow or subscribe to the podcast to get every episode. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate and review Intersectional Psychology in your preferred app. It really helps other people find the podcast. This episode of Intersectional Psychology was researched, written, recorded, and edited by me, Aurora Brown. For a transcript of this episode, please see the link in the show notes on your podcast app or go to intersectionalpsychology.com. You can also check the website or the show notes for a full list of references for this episode. A video of this episode with closed captions is available on youtube.com/@intersectionalpsychology. To support this podcast and get access to bonus content, including additional episodes and interviews, as well as more guided mindfulness sessions, please go to patreon.com/intersectional psychology. You can also chat with me on Blue Sky at intersectpsych.bsky.social and Instagram, Facebook, or TikTok at intersectional psychology. But mostly Blue Sky. Aurora Brown and Intersectional Psychology are committed to the Cite Black Women praxis. All episodes of Intersectional Psychology are for educational purposes only and are not intended to be a substitute for professional mental health advice, diagnosis, or treatment. I, Aurora Brown, am not able to answer specific questions about individual situations. Always seek the advice of your health provider with any questions you may have regarding a mental health condition. Never disregard professional medical advice or delay in seeking it because of something you have heard or seen on this podcast. If you think you need immediate assistance, please call your local emergency number or any mental health crisis hotline. Everyone deserves good mental health.